So I'll just make a few brief comments. One, to thank a couple of people, specifically Professor Bennett, Dr. Bennett, who has been a absolute, integral participant in developing these, extended events and other activities, and has been a major contributor to developing the archives and supporting the Wilhelm Reich Trust and Museum up in Orgone. And I strongly urge everybody, just let me make a little appeal, the museum is, as always, on hard times and looking to raise money, so if you can contribute to the museum, go on their site and make a contribution. It's, well worth it. And right now, they've been attempting to preserve and maintain Reich's original library, and monies are needed for that, and a number of other projects. And people interested in that can talk to, particularly to Dr. Bennett, who's very aware, can give you information, or me, and the other person I'd like to thank, who has been one of my stalwart companions through developing this whole program and all of our seminars. There's some other literature here for people who are interested. David Silver, who is on headphones and camera, who has documented almost all of this work going back to the beginning. It's well over 25 years now. And on our website that he maintains, you can also access a list of all of the videos and audio tapes that we have, including tapes of actually Dr. Sobey and Dr. Rothenberg and a number of other people who are no longer with us or aren't here today. Anyways, promised they would be here, but Dr. Nelson and a number of other people. So there is an active community. I guess I want to start, before I make my initial remarks, introduction. I have the first part of this lecture for me is something I'm very comfortable with, which is its history and dynamic background. The second part, and I have been a little bit more reticent in coming to this particular day in terms of doing a thing on therapy or dealing with the open discussion of therapy and how it works, mainly because I have some sense that it really doesn't address what therapy, it never really manages to get at what therapy, especially orgone therapy, really is. And I guess I'm old school when it comes to that. But that said, I've agreed to participate, therefore I will be a good and willing participant. My background is, as I said, I came to Orgone through a general interest going back for many, many years as a kid, but actively started working with Dr. Sobey in 1976. Just anecdotally, in those days, you got the name of the one or two orgonomists who were around, who were really trained, and you got yourself on a waiting list. There was actually such a thing as a waiting list. And when Dr. Sobey called, or Dr. Handelman, or a few others that were really orgonomists, and said, I have an opening, waited 3 or 4 weeks, and I got a call saying, I have an opening this afternoon at 3 o'clock. No matter what you were doing, you just took it. That was the only way, or it moved on. So that was also, I think, an important distinction. There were, and as often comes up in these discussions, and I think Dr. Schiff already alluded to this, there is a long and active tradition of what is called Reichian therapy. Reich hated that term, hated that idea, and he, as others, as Freud said too, as Freud said about Freudian therapies, that he was the only Freudian. The others were, So it's, just as one is, a psychoanalyst, one can talk about one's orientation or one's particular, relationship to various aspects of Freud's work. In the same thing, if one does this work, and you're trained in this work or actively involved in this work, it's orgonomy. Okay, and if you do treatment, it's orgone treatment, and if you're trained, you should be trained formally as an orgonomist. Reichian therapy is fine. There are all sorts of Reichian offshoots and things that were picked up, whether it was Gestalt or primal or core energetics or any number of things that are related to and use insights and aspects of Reich's work, but the actual clinical practice is orgonomy. So what I will talk about really is the development of orgonomy as a practice, and that is there's a specific arc of development, okay, and that places it into an historical moment. If anything comes up, or people have pressing comments as I move through the historical presentation and critical presentation, feel free to interrupt, since I have a reputation for doing so when I'm sitting on your side. I'm known to not be able to contain my impulse to talk, but for now I have the permission to indulge that, so I will. Anyway, and some of these dates will be less exact, and I'm sure Dr. Bennett and some of you as participants who have been very involved in the history could dispute or argue about whether a date is exactly right. One of the things that Dr. Bennett is doing is really a very careful archival research as to actually when and exactly things actually happened. And Jim Strict, who's a historian of science who's working on orgonomy, is really setting some dates. Some of these dates are inexact, mainly because that's what they were, inexact. I mean, Reich was not one who specifically said on such and such day or such and such time I'm going to start such and such project or I became officially. So in one sense, Reich's interest in orgonomy, if we think of it in terms of his last remarks about his work, which were that he was always consistently pursuing the issue of energy and the nature and function of energy. In one sense, his interest in this really goes back to his earliest, if you read in his memoirs going back to his earliest life, his passion for youth, which is part of the series of memoirs that have been released. The final volume is in preparation now. He talks about basically by around 1919, 1920, as a medical student and as someone who was beginning to enter the psychoanalytic community, beginning to be interested in the nature and function of energy, in the origins of illness and pathology, and begins to talk about it, but certainly doesn't talk about it in anything that would approach his final formulation. But he himself says in Reich Speaks on Freud, which are these wonderful interviews in which he talks about his and reminisces about his involvement with psychoanalysis and with Freud particularly, that he could see a direct red thread throughout his entire career through his work, which was essentially the attempt to understand the nature and function of energy in the living, or in nature. Right? And in one sense, I think that distinguishes Reich in many ways from almost any other therapist, including Freud. I would say, I mean, Dr. Weitzman might argue with that, I'm not sure, but Reich's interest in energetic function from a very, very early stage of his investigations and studies, I think distinguishes him as a very different kind of presence in that world, both for better and worse. I mean, there are times that it leads to conflicts and issues that are not resolvable within the community that he's operated in, and certainly led in some ways, I think, eventually to his moving away from and breaking with the psychoanalytic community. But it remains central to everything I have to say and everything I think that we're going to look at in terms of how orgone therapy works, or what orgone therapy is, or what orgonomy is. I think there'll be distinctions over the day between